All right, let's dive into socio-historical psychology. I think is a really fascinating approach. Instead of seeing you as just a blank slate or, hardwired by instincts only, it views you as someone who is actively shaped by their social and historical context. We're going deep today into this paper. You sent it over to me. It's called Socio-Historical Psychology, an attempt at epistemological and methodological systematization.
Yeah,
It's quite a mouthful.
it is.
But by the end of this deep dive, I think you'll have a really good grasp on how this school of thought views human consciousness, how they go about studying it using different methods,
Yeah.
and how it challenges traditional psychology.
Yeah, it's definitely a very thought-provoking perspective.
I think so, too.
Yeah.
So let's start with the foundation. This whole approach is really rooted in the ideas of Karl Marx, specifically his concept of materialist dialectics. And I know that sounds a little intimidating at first, but it's really about seeing the world as constantly in flux, shaped by contradictions and transformations. Like if you think about the classic nature versus nurture debate, dialectics would say, it's not an either situation, it's both. Our biology and our environment are constantly interacting and influencing each other.
Exactly. And then the materialist part kind of adds another layer to that, emphasizing how real-world conditions, so things like economic systems, social structures, access to resources, all of that shapes how we think and feel.
So it's not just about our individual brains, it's how our thoughts and feelings and actions are really intertwined with this bigger picture around us.
Precisely. We're products of our environment, but
Yeah.
we also have the power to shape that environment as well.
Right, so it's not a one-way street. Now, this is where Lev Vygotsky comes in, a brilliant Russian psychologist in the early 20th century. And he really felt like psychology at the time was missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. He was critical of some of the popular schools of thought, like behaviorism, which, while were focused on these observable actions, seemed to kind of ignore that rich inner world of thoughts and feelings. But then on the flip side, you had introspection, which was all about these subjective reports. It was really hard to make it scientifically rigorous.
So Vygotsky was really trying to build a new psychology, drawing inspiration from Marx.
It's so fascinating how he saw this gap between like breaking down behavior into tiny parts, and then on the other hand, getting lost in these purely subjective experiences. And he argued that both approaches missed this really vital social context.
Ah, so he's saying we can't truly understand the individual
Yeah.
without understanding your social environment.
Right. Vygotsky really believed that even basic functions, like language and thought, have social origins, and they develop through our interactions with others. He saw culture as like an integral part of human development, not just something in the background.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we learn language by interacting with others.
Yeah.
And our cultural background influences the way we think and interpret the world around us.
Absolutely. And he went even further, arguing that even the psychological functions that are happening in our brains are shaped by social interaction. And this really challenged that idea of a fixed human nature, instead proposing that humans are constantly evolving through this engagement with the world. So it's not like there's this predetermined you, it's more that you are constantly changing based on those social experiences.
That's the idea. And this is where some of the key concepts of historical psychology really come into play. The paper talks a lot about how central social interaction is to our development as human beings. It argues that our consciousness arises from these interactions with others and the cultural tools that we inherit.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. What exactly do we mean when we say cultural tools?
So think about things like language, symbols, technology, even social norms and values. These are all tools that we inherit and use to kind of navigate the world around us.
And language plays a particularly powerful role, I imagine.
Absolutely. It's not just about communication. It's about mediating our relationship with the world and internalizing social meanings. Through language, we're able to understand abstract concepts, share our thoughts and feelings, and actually build a shared understanding with others.
So it's like language gives us those building blocks to construct our understanding of reality. But those building blocks are provided by our social and cultural context.
Precisely. And through this sharing of meanings, we develop something called intersubjectivity, which is that sense of shared understanding and connection with other people. It's how we move from being isolated individuals to being part of a larger social fabric.
So we're not just individuals bouncing around in our own heads.
Yeah.
We're constantly shaped by those around us.
It's exactly our sense of self, beliefs, values. They're all kind of interwoven with that social fabric that we're a part of.
But how do emotions fit into all of this? Because they seem so personal and internal.
That's a good question. And socio-historical psychology really emphasizes that even our emotions are intertwined with our thoughts. They influence how we think, and both are shaped by our social experiences. It's about recognizing that we're not just rational machines processing information. We're complex beings with feelings, and those feelings play a huge role in how we perceive and interact with the world.
And you know, one thing I've noticed is that the paper spends a good chunk of time discussing how this challenges some of the more traditional psychological approaches, especially those that view the mind as separate from its social context.
Yeah, that's a key point of divergence. It really pushes back against this individualistic mentality, that pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality. That's so prevalent, I think, in our culture. It argues that our individual struggles and successes are often a product of larger systems and historical forces, not just personal effort.
So instead of simply focusing on individual solutions, we need to consider those broader social structures that are influencing our lives as well.
Exactly. It encourages us to think beyond individual therapy or self-help and consider how we might work to change those structures for the better. For example, if someone is struggling with anxiety due to economic insecurity, simply teaching them coping mechanisms might not be enough. We also need to address those systemic issues, like poverty and lack of access to resources, that are contributing to their anxiety in the first place.
Right. It's about looking at the root causes. That makes a lot of sense. So how does this perspective actually play out in research? If it's so focused on the social and historical context, I imagine it must be pretty different from your typical lab experiment.
You're absolutely right. It's not about isolating variables
Mm.
and controlling every aspect of the environment. Socio-historical psychology really favors qualitative research methods
Mhm.
that delve into lived experiences and the meanings that people create within their social worlds.
So instead of observing behavior, from this detached perspective, it's about understanding the underlying reasons, motivations, historical influences that drive those actions.
Precisely. It's about getting up close and personal with the data, using tools like in-depth interviews, participant observation, or even analyzing how people talk about their experiences. The goal is to capture the richness and complexity of human life within its social context.
I can see how that could offer some really valuable insights. But, you know, how does this all connect back to me, the listener? Why should I care about this seemingly obscure branch of psychology?
Well, here's the key takeaway. Socio-historical psychology isn't just about understanding the human mind. It's about using that understanding to promote positive change. It's about raising awareness of social and historical influences, empowering individuals to challenge oppressive structures, and ultimately fostering more just and equitable societies. It sees psychology as a tool for social transformation, not just individual adjustment.
So it's about recognizing that our personal well-being is fundamentally connected to the well-being of our communities and the world around us.
Exactly. It's a perspective that encourages us to see ourselves as part of this larger web of interconnectedness, and to use our understanding of the human mind to create a better world for everyone.
That's a great note to end on, but we're just getting started. In the next part of our deep dive, we're going to be exploring some of the specific concepts and research findings that have emerged from this unique perspective, so stay tuned.
And that kind of brings us to the heart of this paper you shared. It really delves into the historical and theoretical underpinnings of socio-historical psychology, tracing its roots back to Marx's analysis of 19th century Europe.
Yeah.
He's writing at a time when capitalism was rapidly transforming society. Think about new technologies, booming industries, a growing working class.
Wow, it sounds like a period of just immense change, almost like a societal earthquake. How did Marx connect all of that to psychology?
Well, he saw how these material conditions were shaping not just the economic landscape, but also the way people thought, felt, and related to each other. He argued that the way we produce things, what he called the economic base of society, heavily influences everything else, including our psychology.
So he's saying our ideas don't just shape the world, but the material conditions of our existence actually shape our ideas.
Exactly. It's a powerful concept called historical materialism. Our consciousness isn't some detached entity floating above the material world. It's rooted in the concrete realities of our lives. For example, think about how the rise of factory work during the Industrial Revolution changed people's understanding of time and productivity. Suddenly, time became a commodity, something to be measured and maximized for profit.
Wow. It's fascinating to think about how something as seemingly fundamental as our perception of time can be influenced by economic systems. So how did Vygotsky build on these ideas?
Vygotsky took those Marxist ideas and applied them specifically to the field of psychology. But he wasn't content to just describe how things worked. He wanted to understand them.
Yeah.
how human consciousness could be harnessed for social change. And that's where his concept of the zone of proximal development comes in.
Right, the ZPDD. I remember learning about that in a psychology class. But it was presented as just a theory of learning. How does it tie into this bigger picture of social transformation?
Well, the ZPD isn't just about individual learning. It highlights the crucial role of social interaction in development. It's about recognizing that we don't develop in isolation. We grow through collaboration and the sharing of knowledge. Imagine a child learning to ride a bike. They might struggle on their own, but with the guidance of a parent or older sibling, they can achieve something they couldn't do independently, that space between what they can do alone and what they can achieve with support. That's the ZPD.
Ah, okay. So it's not just about focusing on what a person can't do, but on their potential with the right kind of support. But how does this lead to social transformation?
Think about the implications for education, parenting, even workplace training. If we can understand how to create those ZPDs, how to scaffold learning, and provide effective support, we can unlock incredible potential, not just in individuals, but in entire communities. It becomes a tool for empowerment and social change.
It seems like this perspective is really shifting the focus from the individual to the collective.
Absolutely. And that's where the role of culture becomes so important. The paper draws on the work of cultural psychologists, who argue that our psychological experiences are not universal, but shaped by the specific cultures we inhabit.
So there's no single human nature that exists independently of culture.
Not according to this perspective. What it means to be human, how we think, feel, and behave, is deeply intertwined with cultural norms, values, and practices. Even seemingly universal emotions can be experienced and expressed differently across cultures. The paper mentions an example of how the Tahitian language doesn't have a word for sadness. And research suggests that Tahitians experience and express sadness in ways distinct from Western cultures.
That's so interesting. It makes you realize how much we take for granted as natural is actually culturally constructed. This must have huge implications for how we approach things like mental health, right?
Absolutely. We can't assume that the same diagnostic criteria or treatment methods will be effective across cultures. We need to understand the meaning of symptoms and behaviors within their cultural context, rather than imposing our own cultural interpretation.
It seems like this perspective could lead to a much more nuanced and culturally sensitive approach to mental health care.
That's the goal. And the paper takes it a step further by introducing this concept of historical consciousness.
Okay, historical consciousness, is that about like how we learn history in school?
No, not quite. It's the idea that we're not just shaped by our immediate social context, but by the broader sweep of history. Events that happened generations ago can have a ripple effect on our present-day experiences.
Do you mean like how your grandparents' experiences might impact you, even though you didn't live through those events yourself?
Exactly. It's about how historical forces become embodied in our families, communities, and even our own psyches. The paper mentions the concept of intergenerational trauma, where the effects of historical oppression, violence, or displacement can be passed down through generations.
Wow, that's a powerful example. So it's not just about understanding individuals, it's about understanding how individuals are embedded within these larger systems of history and power.
Precisely. And recognizing that the past isn't really past. It continues to shape us in profound ways.
I'm starting to see how this perspective could be really useful in understanding things like systemic racism or ongoing social inequalities. It's not just about individual prejudice, it's about how those prejudices are rooted in historical systems of oppression. But where does individual agency fit in all of this? It seems like there's a danger of becoming overly deterministic, suggesting our lives are just products of social forces.
That's an important question, and the paper addresses it directly. Socio-historical psychology doesn't deny individual agency. It simply recognizes the ways in which our choices and actions are shaped by the social and historical forces around us. It's about understanding the constraints we face, but also the possibilities for change.
So it's not saying we're powerless, but rather that we need to be aware of the forces that influence us in order to effectively navigate and challenge them.
Exactly. And that's where critical thinking comes in. Socio-historical psychology encourages us to examine our own assumptions, to question the taken-for-granted narratives of our culture, and to become aware of the ways in which ideology can limit our thinking and our potential.
So it's not just about understanding the past, but about using that understanding to create a more just and equitable future.
Precisely. And that brings us to another important concept, ideology. The paper raises this question of how we distinguish between our own genuine beliefs and values, and those that have been unconsciously absorbed from the dominant culture.
It's almost like trying to see the matrix, that underlying code that shapes our reality, without us even realizing it.
Exactly. Ideology can operate in subtle and often invisible ways, shaping our perceptions, thoughts, and actions, without us even realizing it. We might think we're making free and independent choices, but those choices are often constrained by the ideological frameworks we've inherited.
So how do we break free from that? How do we develop that critical lens?
Well, socio-historical psychology emphasizes the importance of education and critical thinking. It's about learning to question the dominant narratives, to seek out alternative perspectives, and to develop our own informed opinions, especially in today's world, where we're bombarded with information from all sides.
Right. We're living in the age of information overload, fake news, social media algorithms. It can be hard to know what to believe.
Exactly. Socio-historical psychology gives us tools to critically evaluate information, to discern fact from fiction, and to become active and engaged citizens who are not easily swayed by propaganda or manipulation.
It sounds like this perspective has a lot to offer when it comes to navigating the complexities of the modern world. But how does it actually translate into practical action? How can we use these ideas to create positive change?
Well, the paper argues that socio-historical psychology can be a powerful tool for social transformation, particularly in areas like education, community development, and social justice.
Let's dive into those. How would this perspective inform education, for example?
Well, it emphasizes the social and collaborative nature of learning. Rather than just drilling facts and figures, it's about creating learning environments where students can interact with each other, share ideas, and construct knowledge together.
So it's about encouraging active learning and critical thinking, rather than passive absorption of information.
Exactly. And it also highlights the importance of cultural and historical context in education. We need to be sensitive to cultural differences and create inclusive learning environments that value and celebrate diversity.
Yeah, that makes sense. Not all students come from the same background, so we need to create learning experiences that are relevant and engaging for everyone. What about community development? How can socio-historical psychology be applied in that area?
It emphasizes the importance of empowering communities to identify and address their own needs. It's not about outsiders coming in and imposing solutions. It's about working collaboratively with communities to understand their strengths, challenges, and aspirations, and recognizing that social change happens from the ground up.
So it's about facilitating community-led solutions rather than top-down interventions.
Exactly. And this perspective can also inform our approach to psychotherapy.
Oh, that's interesting. I wouldn't have immediately thought of therapy.
Yeah.
As a place to apply these ideas, how does it work?
Well, it encourages therapists to see their clients' problems, not just as individual issues, but as potentially rooted in larger social and historical forces. It's not just about addressing symptoms. It's about understanding the context in which those symptoms arise and helping clients develop a critical awareness of the social and historical factors that may be contributing to their distress.
So it's about empowering clients to see the connections between their personal struggles and larger societal issues.
Exactly. It's about helping them understand that they're not alone in their struggles and that their experiences are often a product of larger systems of power, privilege, and oppression. And once they have that awareness, they can start to challenge those systems and create positive change in their lives.
It sounds like a powerful approach to therapy, one that moves beyond just individual healing to social transformation. But the paper doesn't shy away from acknowledging some of the criticisms leveled in socio-historical psychology, right?
That's right. One common critique is that it's too focused on the social and historical, and not enough on the individual. Some critics argue that it can be overly deterministic, suggesting that our lives are simply products of our social conditions, and neglecting individual agency.
But the authors counter that it doesn't deny individual agency.
Exactly. They argue that socio-historical psychology simply recognizes the ways in which our choices and actions are shaped by the social and historical forces around us. It's about understanding the constraints we face, but also the possibilities for change.
So it's not saying we're powerless, but rather that we need to be aware of the forces that influence us in order to effectively navigate and challenge them.
Precisely. And they also address the criticism that socio-historical psychology can be too ideologically driven, particularly by Marxist ideas, but they argue that any psychology is inherently ideological.
Meaning it's impossible to study the human mind without bringing our own values and assumptions to the table.
Exactly. The key is to be aware of our own biases and to strive for objectivity in our research and analysis.
So it's not about denying the influence of ideology, but about being transparent about our own perspectives and acknowledging the limitations of any single viewpoint.
That's the idea. The paper concludes by calling for further research and development in the field of socio-historical psychology, emphasizing its potential to contribute to our understanding of human phenomena, from learning and development to mental health and social change.
It seems like there's still so much to learn and explore within this perspective. Where do they suggest we go from here?
Well, they highlight the need for more cross-cultural research. That takes into account the diversity of human experience. It's about moving beyond Western-centric models of psychology and embracing a more global and inclusive perspective.
That makes sense. We can't assume that what's true for one culture will be true for all cultures. How can we ensure this kind of inclusive and diverse research happens?
The authors call for greater collaboration across disciplines, cultures, and perspectives, bringing together researchers from psychology, sociology, anthropology, history, and other fields to create a richer and more nuanced understanding of what it means to be human.
It sounds like a truly interdisciplinary effort. But what about the practical side of things? How can we start to apply these ideas in the real world?
That's where the rubber meets the road. The paper suggests several avenues for applying. Socio-historical psychology. One is in the field of education. Imagine classrooms where students are not passive recipients of knowledge, but active participants in constructing their own understanding.
I love that idea. Instead of memorizing facts, students would be encouraged to think critically, question assumptions, and engage in meaningful dialogue with each other.
Exactly. It's about creating a learning environment that fosters curiosity, collaboration, and a deeper understanding of the world around them.
So it sounds like socio-historical psychology is really about connecting those dots, between our inner world and the outer world, recognizing that they're constantly shaping each other.
Absolutely. And that leads us to the methodology, which, as you might have guessed, is quite different from the traditional experimental approach you see in a lot of psychology.
So no white lab coats and controlled experiments in this branch of psychology.
Not quite. Socio-historical psychology really emphasizes understanding the individual within their natural, social, and historical context. It's less about trying to isolate variables and more about seeing the person as an active agent embedded in this complex web of relationships, meanings, and historical forces.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So what kind of research methods do they use? If it's not about controlled experiments, how do they actually study these things?
Well, they often employ qualitative methods like in-depth interviews, participant observation, and discourse analysis. Instead of focusing on quantifiable data points, they really delve into the richness and complexity of human experience through stories, narratives, and the meanings people ascribe to their world.
Yeah, it makes sense that if you're interested in how history and culture shape a person, you need to go beyond just measuring their behavior in a lab setting. But can you give me a concrete example of how this might work in practice?
Sure, imagine a researcher studying the impact of historical trauma on a particular community. They might spend months living in that community, participating in daily life, conducting in-depth interviews with residents, and carefully analyzing the stories and narratives that emerge. It's about understanding the lived experience of trauma, not just through individual accounts, but through the collective memory and shared experiences of the community.
So it sounds like the researcher almost becomes part of the community they're studying.
In a way, yes, it's about building relationships, gaining trust, and understanding the nuances of culture and context. It requires a lot of sensitivity and humility on the part of the researcher.
And this approach aligns perfectly with the core principles of socio-historical psychology, right?
Exactly. It recognizes that human consciousness is not something that can be easily measured or quantified. It's about understanding the subjective experiences of individuals within their specific social and historical contexts. And that requires qualitative methods that can capture the richness and depth of those experiences.
I see. And it seems like this could offer really valuable insights into addressing social problems as well. Instead of relying on statistics or broad generalizations, we're getting a much more nuanced understanding of how these issues actually play out in people's lives.
That's one of the key strengths of this perspective. It moves us away from simplistic solutions and encourages us to consider the complex web of factors that contribute to social issues. It's about recognizing that there's no one-size-fits-all solution, and that any intervention needs to be tailored to the specific social and historical context.
So it's not just about understanding the problem, it's about finding solutions that actually work within a specific community or cultural context.
Precisely, it's about moving beyond just identifying the problem and working collaboratively with communities to develop solutions that are both effective and culturally relevant.
This deep dive has been so enlightening, but before we wrap up, I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the practical applications of socio-historical psychology. The paper mentioned fields like education, community development, and psychotherapy. Can you elaborate on those a bit more?
Absolutely. In education, socio-historical psychology challenges that traditional model of the teacher as the sole holder of knowledge and the student as a passive recipient. Instead, it emphasizes the social and collaborative nature of learning. Imagine classrooms where students are working together, sharing ideas and learning from each other's experiences.
It sounds a lot more engaging and empowering than just sitting in rows listening to lectures. Do you have any examples of how this might look in a real classroom setting?
Sure, think about a history class. Instead of just memorizing dates and names, students could engage in role-playing activities, debates, or research projects that require them to critically examine historical events from multiple perspectives. They could explore how those events have shaped the present day and discuss how they relate to their own lives and identities.
It sounds like it would bring history to life and make it much more relevant to students.
Exactly. And in community development, socio-historical psychology can be used to help communities identify their own needs and create solutions that are grounded in their unique history and culture. It's about empowering communities to take ownership of their own development and create lasting change.
Can you give me an example of how this might work in practice?
Sure, imagine a community that has been struggling with high rates of youth unemployment instead of imposing an outside solution. A community developer, using a socio-historical psychology lens, might work with residents to explore the historical and economic factors that have contributed to this problem. They might help residents organize community forums, conduct needs assessments, and develop job training programs that are tailored to the specific needs and aspirations of the community.
It sounds like a much more effective and sustainable approach than just throwing money at the problem or implementing a generic solution.
Exactly, and socio-historical psychology has a lot to offer the field of psychotherapy as well.
I'm really interested in this. How does this perspective change the way therapists approach mental health?
What encourages therapists to see their clients' problems not simply as individual issues, but as potentially rooted in larger social and historical forces. For example, a therapist working with a client struggling with anxiety might explore how factors like discrimination, economic insecurity, or historical trauma might be contributing to their distress.
So instead of just focusing on changing the client's thoughts and behaviors, the therapist would also help them understand the broader context of their struggles.
Exactly. It's about helping clients see the connections between their personal experiences and the larger social forces that shape their lives. This can be incredibly empowering because it helps them understand that they're not alone in their struggles and that their experiences are often a product of systemic issues, not personal failings.
It sounds like a very holistic and empowering approach to therapy, one that recognizes the interconnectedness of our inner world and the outer world.
Precisely, it's about helping clients develop a critical awareness of the forces that shape their lives and empowering them to create positive change, both within themselves and within their communities.
This has been such a fascinating and thought-provoking deep dive. What stands out to you as the most important takeaway for our listeners?
I think the key takeaway is that we're not just individuals floating in a vacuum. We're deeply embedded in social and historical contexts that shape our thoughts, feelings, behaviors, and even our very understanding of ourselves. Socio-historical psychology offers a powerful framework for understanding this interconnectedness and using it to create a more just and equitable world.
I couldn't agree more. It's a perspective that challenges us to think critically, question assumptions, and work together to create a better future. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us. We'll catch you next time on The Deep Dive.